And I call the honourable member for Melbourne Ports.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. It's good to see you better. Ever since they measured the halfway point between Sydney and Melbourne wrongly to make the nation's capital closer to New South Wales and Victoria, Melburnians somehow feel they're getting raw deals from the Commonwealth. Our Sydney Prime Minister, member for Wentworth, just like the last Sydney Prime Minister, and their Sydney Treasurers and Sydney Major Project Ministers are doing an exceptionally good job in disadvantaging Melbourne. Never mind that Melbourne is the fastest growing city in the country, projected to overtake Sydney by 2050. Never mind that we take 35% of all new immigrants to Australia, which we absolutely support and welcome because Melbourne is the most multicultural city in the country. Wentworth still wants to rip off Melbourne in partisan politics similar to the previous Prime Minister against the popular Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews. Prime Minister Turnbull's games, just like the previous Prime Minister's games with Victorian infrastructure spending, have got to stop. I'll continue to argue that Melbourne is being cheated as long as I have to, because that's exactly how most Melburnians feel. The Victorian electorate voted for public transport in 2014, and the Andrews government have been waiting since for the federal government to fund its preferred infrastructure model, Melbourne Metro rail project. It's not Victorians' arbitrary priority. It's the project that Infrastructure Australia has twice assessed with two separate business cases as being a top-level priority for Victoria. Melbourne's public transport system is full. It's over capacity, in fact. The City Loop is full. Trains at peak hour are well and truly full. 1,200 people cramming into 800 capacity trains, Tokyo style. Train usage in Melbourne has risen 40% in 5 years, 70% in a decade. We can't add any more trains to the City Loop. We need the Metro to link the northern suburbs to the hospital and university district around Victoria Parade in the inner south and east via the Domain interchange, which links trams and trains in my electorate of Melbourne Ports. The Victorian government has been asking for $4.5 billion of the $10.9 billion Melbourne Metro cost since it came to office. It took almost 2 years for the government to offer an insulting $10 million. You didn't mishear me. They offered $10 million while they kept $3 billion locked away up in the cancelled East-West link. They offered $500 million for the Monash Freeway, which the state government has only asked for part of its $400 million price tag. The Victorian government handed down its budget last week and committed the full $11 billion while running a healthier than expected surplus to public transport to Melbourne Metro. Now, before the federal budget has been handed down, without even consulting the state government, we hear from News Limited that their leaked information that the Commonwealth will give it not just $10 million, but less than $900 million, still well below the $4.5 billion needed for the project. As Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas said today, this is a ridiculous trick aimed at self-promotion, as Victoria is going to get the money anyway under the asset recycling program, under which Commonwealth refunds a state 15% of the value of any state asset that it's leased. The Treasurer said, the Victorian Treasurer said, quote, "This money is money the Commonwealth owes the state for the lease of the Port of Melbourne. This is not new funding. It's just a broken promise from a Canberra coalition government more intent on self-promotion than integrity. Victoria is receiving but 9% of infrastructure spending compared to 36% in New South Wales. Victorians have had enough. Even the Assistant Treasurer, my neighbour, the member for Higgins, is apparently sick of it. She started a petition to ask the state government to expand Melbourne Metro to South Yarra in her electorate, which is minutes away by tram from the Domain. You can be forgiven for laughing at the idea of the Assistant Treasurer of Australia starting a local petition to expand a major project her government refuses to fund. If only there was something the Assistant Treasurer could do something about it. We shouldn't be surprised that the Prime Minister doesn't understand Melbourne. He told Melbourne Radio that 3AW that he was expanding the Western Ring Road to connect Port Melbourne to the airport. I'll give the Prime Minister a geography lesson. The Western Ring Road leads to the west of Victoria. Port Melbourne is in the inner south, on the eastern side of the bay. Wentworth's face is up on billboards in Port Melbourne, overlapping with a local Liberal candidate. How sad he can't even find Port Melbourne on a map. It's not really that far from the Melbourne Club, where the Prime Minister likes to take selfies outside before he gets on a tram for a one-off journey. One Sydney man who knows his way to Melbourne ports is Anthony Albanese. the member for Grainler, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, who joined me at the Domain interchange a couple of months ago before addressing hundreds of people in the middle of a workday to discuss Labor's plans to make Melbourne public transport infrastructure, Melbourne Metro specifically, the top priority of a Labor government. The message to Melburnians is clear. If you want a government that will fund your public infrastructure funding, let alone one you can understand a map of Melbourne, you need to vote for a Labor government.
And I